rose-tinted air inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford felt suddenly heavy, thick with the electric hum of a world about to change. It was 2 o'clock in the morning in the heart of the Persian Gulf, and the silence of the night was shattered by a single, sharp chirp from a radar console. This wasn't a commercial flight or a stray drone from the coast. This was a signature the United States Navy had been dreading since the first delivery crates arrived in Tehran 2 years ago. Two Sukhoi Su-35 fighter jets, the crowning jewels of the Iranian Air Force, had just crossed the line of death. They weren't just patrolling, they were hunting. Vampire, vampire! No, wait, those are bandits! Multiple bogies, high speed bearing 045, the radar intercept officer shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. On the glowing glass screens, two yellow icons pulsed like a heartbeat. They were moving at Mach 1.2, cutting through the humid Gulf air with the predatory grace of Russian engineering fueled by Iranian defiance. For decades, the skies over these waters belonged to the Americans and their aging F-18 Hornets. But tonight, the game had changed. The Sukhoi Su-35, known to NATO as the Flanker E, was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a physical reality, screaming toward the world's most advanced aircraft carrier at nearly 1,000 miles per hour. Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne stood at the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the trajectory. He didn't blink. He knew exactly what those jets carried under their wings. The R-37M, a long-range air-to-air missile designed specifically to snip the wings of American air superiority before they could even see the enemy. The atmosphere in the room shifted from routine to a state of high-stakes combat. You could smell the ozone from the cooling systems and the cold sweat of the young technicians. This was the moment the world had feared since 2024, when the military alliance between Moscow and Tehran solidified into a steel fist. "They're painting us, Admiral," the tactical director reported, his hand hovering over the communication toggle. The lead Su-35 has engaged its IRGC radar. They are in full-power search mode. They've locked the Ford. Thorne leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the console. This was a direct challenge, a digital slap in the face of the United States Navy. The Iranians weren't just testing the perimeter. They were simulating a terminal strike. The Su-35 is a 4.5 generation monster, a super flanker with thrust vectoring engines that allow it to dance in the sky in ways an American pilot hasn't seen since the height of the Cold War. It was a message sent from the highest levels of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The Persian Gulf is no longer an American lake. "Do not fire," Thorne commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Not yet. I want to see how far they're willing to push this. Launch the Alert 5. I want 2 lightnings in the air before those flankers can even smell the carrier's fuel." Outside on the massive flight deck, the darkness was torn apart by the blue-white roar of Pratt & Whitney engines. 2 F-35C Lightning jets hissed into the night, their stealth coatings swallowing the moonlight. This wasn't just a scramble, it was the opening move of a high-speed chess match where the price of a mistake was a world war. The Su-35 was designed to kill F-15s and F-18s, but it had never gone head-to-head with the invisible teeth of the F-35. As the Iranian pilots closed the distance, they thought they were the predators. They had no idea they were flying into a digital trap designed 30 years ago for this exact moment. To understand the sheer audacity of this moment, you have to understand what the Sukhoi Su-35 represented to the Iranian High Command in 2026. For decades, the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force was little more than a flying museum, a collection of aging F-14 Tomcats and F-4 Phantoms held together by black market parts and sheer willpower. But the geopolitical earthquake of 2024 changed everything. In a series of shadow deals conducted in the gilded halls of the Kremlin, Moscow traded its most lethal air superiority fighter for a steady stream of Iranian drone technology and ballistic missiles. When those first crates arrived at Mehrabad Air Base, the balance of power in the Middle East didn't just shift, it shattered. The Su-35, or the Flanker E, is a 40-ton masterpiece of aerodynamic violence. It is a 4.5 generation fighter that treats the laws of physics as mere suggestions. With its three-dimensional thrust vectoring engines, the Su-35 can perform the Pugachev's Cobra, standing on its tail in midair to force a pursuing enemy to overshoot. But it wasn't the acrobatics that worried the Pentagon in 2026. It was the IRGC radar. This passive, electronically scanned array system is a digital predator, capable of detecting a stealth fighter at nearly 100 miles and a standard warship at over 250 miles. In the hands of a determined pilot, the Su-35 was designed to be an eagle killer. Inside the lead cockpit was Colonel Abbas Rahmani, a man whose entire career had been defined by the crushing weight of American sanctions. As he felt the raw power of the twin Saturn AL-41 F-1S engines vibrating through his spine, he wasn't just flying a mission. He was seeking redemption for 40 years of perceived humiliation. Under his wings hung the R-37M, a hypersonic air-to-air missile with a range of 200 miles. It is known in intelligence circles as the AWACS killer, designed to decapitate the eyes and ears of a U.S. carrier strike group before a single American pilot can pull a trigger. "Eagle One to command," Rahmani whispered into his oxygen mask, his breath ragged as the G-force began to climb. "The American giant is in my sights. The Urbis has a solid track on the Ford. We are 3 minutes from weapons release." In the war rooms of Tehran, the atmosphere was electric. This was the gamble of the century. By sending their most expensive assets directly at a U.S. supercarrier, they were betting that the Su-35's Advanced Electronic Warfare Suite, the Kibini-M, could blind the American Aegis combat system. They believed that the Russian technology had finally given them a shield that could withstand the American sword. Rahmani watched his glass cockpit displays flicker with data. He saw the American carrier as a glowing heat signature on his infrared search and track system. To him, the Gerald R. Ford looked like a fat, slow target. He felt the surge of adrenaline that comes when a hunter finally corners a lion. But Rahmani was about to learn a brutal lesson in the difference between having the world's best hardware and having the world's most integrated digital ecosystem. He thought he was the one doing the hunting, but in the silent, invisible realms of the electromagnetic spectrum, the trap was already closing around his neck. The distance between the two Iranian Sukhois and the American carrier strike group was shrinking with terrifying speed. 50 miles, 45, 40. Inside the cockpit of his Su-35, Colonel Rahmani felt the surge of power that only a pilot of an elite machine can know. His head-up display was a symphony of green light, showing a steady lock on the massive silhouette of the Gerald R. Ford. But then, the static in his headset died, replaced by a voice so clear and calm, it felt like the speaker was sitting in the empty seat behind him. "Colonel Rahmani, this is Commander Jack Viper Dalton, Commander of Carrier Air Wing 8. You are currently heading on a vector that will lead to your immediate destruction. I suggest you check your 6 o'clock before you make a mistake your family in Tehran will have to live with forever." Rahmani froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. How did they know his name? How was the signal so clear through the Kibini-M electronic jamming suite that was supposed to be flooding the American frequencies with noise? He jerked his head to the left, then the right. Nothing but the dark, empty expanse of the Gulf and the distant glimmer of the Iranian coastline. "You are bluffing, Commander," Rahmani spat into his mask, his voice tight with a mixture of bravado and budding terror. "My IRGC radar shows an empty sky. You have no one in the air but 2 tankers 50 miles to your west. You are defenseless. The era of American bullying in these waters ended the day these Sukhois touched down in Shiraz. There was a short, sharp chuckle on the other end of the line, a sound of pure, condescending pity. "Colonel, look at your fuel gauge," Dalton's voice returned, dropping to a cold, predatory whisper. "You've been burning combat power for 15 minutes. You think you're hunting us? You're not even the main event. Look at your right wingtip. Now." Rahmani whipped his head to the right. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, as if materializing out of the very fabric of the night, the jagged, matte black silhouette of an F-35C Lightning appeared less than 20 feet from his wing. It hadn't climbed up to him. It hadn't dived. It had simply become. The American pilot was so close that Rahmani could see the glow of the cockpit displays reflecting off the gold-tinted visor of the pilot's helmet. The F-35 wasn't just there. It was mocking him. Its weapons bay doors cycled open for a fraction of a second, revealing the sleek, deadly shape of an AIM-120D missile before snapping shut again. "Your Russian radar is looking for a door to kick down, Colonel," Dalton continued, his voice like grinding stones. "But my F-35s are the ghosts in your house. We've been flying formation with you since you crossed the 12-mile limit. I could have turned you into a fireball 10 minutes ago, and your ground control would still be looking for a radar blip. Your Su-35 is a beautiful bird, truly, a masterpiece of the 20th century. But it is a blind giant in a world of invisible assassins. Turn around, Abbas, go home, see your wife, and tell your generals that the Persian Gulf still has a master they cannot see." Rahmani's hand trembled on the flight stick. The psychological dominance was total. He looked at his advanced Russian displays. They were still clear, still showing an empty sky. The Su-35, the supposed F-22 killer, was staring directly at its executioner and seeing absolutely nothing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't a warrior in a duel. He was a target in a laboratory. The super flanker wasn't a shield. It was a coffin. The moment of truth arrived not with a roar of cannons, but with a suffocating digital silence. As Colonel Rahmani stared at the F-35C hovering off his wing, the "then this happened" moment shifted from a psychological game to a technical nightmare. At precisely 2:15 in the morning, the entire electronic ecosystem of the Sukhoi Su-35S collapsed. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a surgical decapitation of the jet's brain. Behind the F-35C, hovering 10,000 feet higher and miles away, were the true architects of this blackout. Two EA-18G Growlers. These electronic attack aircraft had unleashed the next-generation jammer, a system specifically tuned in 2025 to exploit the unique frequencies of the Russian-made Irbis-E radar. On Rahmani's glass cockpit displays, the steady green data suddenly turned into a chaotic vomit of digital noise. His radar screen blossomed with 1,000 ghost targets. One moment there was nothing. The next it looked like an entire fleet of hundreds of American bombers was diving on Tehran. "Command, I have multiple contacts. 1,000 bogeys. My systems are failing," Rahmani screamed into his mask, but no one was listening. The Growlers had flooded the Iranian communication bands with high-intensity white noise. He was screaming into a dead void. This is the hidden reality of 21st century warfare. The Su-35 is a kinetic masterpiece, built for a world of dogfights and visual maneuvers. But the Americans had turned the air around him into a digital cage. The F-35C wasn't just a jet. It was a node in a massive, invisible web. Through the Link 16 data bus, the Carrier, the Growlers, and the stealth fighters were sharing a single, perfect picture of the battlespace. While Rahmani was blind, looking at a screen of static, the American pilots were seeing him in high-definition infrared. They weren't just tracking his plane, they were tracking the movement of his fingers on the throttle. The Su-35's Kabini M jamming suite, once touted by Moscow as the Aegis killer, was useless. In the 2 years since 2024, the U.S. Navy had analyzed every pulse and wave of the Russian system captured during the conflicts in Eastern Europe. They hadn't just built a counter, they had built a digital kill switch. Ramani tried to switch his weapons to manual infrared tracking, hoping to use his heat-seeking sensors to at least get a parting shot. But the F-35C's thermal signature was almost non-existent, its engine heat masked by the cold air of the high-altitude Gulf night. Inside the Gerald R. Ford's Combat Center, Admiral Thorne watched the data feed. The two Iranian Sukhois were now drifting, their flight paths becoming erratic as the pilots panicked. They were no longer elite hunters. They were two very expensive pieces of metal floating in a sea of American interference. "They're losing cohesion," the tactical officer noted, his voice devoid of emotion. "The wingman is banking hard toward the coast. Ramani is stalling. He's realized his R-37 missiles are paperweights if the radar can't give them a mid-course update." It was a total technical eclipse. The Su-35, for all its thrust-vectoring engines and heavy missiles, had been neutralized without a single kinetic shot being fired. The Americans had proven that in 2026, the loudest jet in the sky is usually the first one to die. The Su-35 was designed to fight a war of fire and steel, but the Americans had invited them to a war of bits and bytes, and the Iranians had arrived unarmed. The tension reached its breaking point at 2:20 in the morning. Colonel Ramani, his pride shattered along with his radar lock, made the only decision that would allow him to see the sunrise. He pulled his flight stick hard to the right, the G-force pinning him into his seat as the two Sukhoi Su-35s banked away from the American carrier group. Their afterburners lit up the dark water of the Persian Gulf like twin candles of defeat. They weren't flying back to base with a victory, they were fleeing a ghost. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the yellow icons on the screen began to distance themselves from the flagship. The aggressive chirping of the alarms died down, replaced by the rhythmic clicking of keyboards and the steady breathing of a crew that had just stared into the abyss of a regional war and didn't blink. Admiral Thorne watched the retreat on the master display, his face a mask of cold professional satisfaction. He knew that tonight wasn't just a tactical win, it was a strategic execution of a narrative. The world had been told that the Su-35 was the ultimate answer to American dominance. In 2026, Tehran and Moscow had marketed this aircraft as an invincible shield. But the reality that played out over the Strait of Hormuz proved that in the modern era, the platform, the physical plane itself, is secondary to the network. The Sukhois were magnificent pieces of machinery, but they were operating in a vacuum. The U.S. Navy, however, was operating as a single, multi-headed organism. The F-35, the Growler, and the Aegis cruisers were not three separate units. They were a single digital consciousness. This encounter will be studied in military academies for the next decade. It proved that the legendary maneuverability of the Flanker E means nothing if the pilot cannot find a target to maneuver against. It proved that the R-37M missile, for all its hypersonic speed, is useless if its eyes are blinded by a digital fog. Most importantly, it sent a message to every regional power considering a challenge to the status quo. The United States has moved the battlefield into a dimension that most nations haven't even begun to map. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale gold light over the quiet waters of the Gulf, the two F-35Cs returned to the deck of the Ford. There were no victory rolls, no celebratory radio chatter. There was only the professional efficiency of a superpower that had just reminded the world why it holds the keys to the global commons. The Su-35s landed back in Iran, their fuel tanks nearly empty, and their pilots forever changed. They had seen the future of warfare, and they realized they were part of the past. If you are still with us, we would like to thank you for your time and attention. Your support is the vital fuel that allows our team to continue producing these deep dive analyses and bringing these high-stakes scenarios to life. If you found this breakdown of the Su-35 encounter valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Your engagement truly helps us grow. We are very interested to hear your perspective in the comments. In this new era of electronic and stealth warfare, do you think traditional dogfighting has a future, or has the battle been moved entirely into the digital realm? If you have no specific thoughts to share, but enjoyed the release, even a simple "thank you" in the comments would mean a great deal to our entire production team. Thank you for being with us.